I'd like to go to you, Mr. Tenaglia, for just a moment, if I might. You spoke about contractors and the fact that so many are holding, for lack of a better term, property. I'm assuming you've had a chance to look at the total amount at some point in time. Would you consider it to be a staggering amount of money?
So reading what the GAO has observed, it is staggering. I believe on the order of $3 trillion, something to that effect.
Let's get into what Representative Kweisi Mfume had to say about the Department of Defense's spending, and honestly, some of these ridiculous practices going on with taxpayer money. Now, Mfume brought up something we should all be worried about: contractors just holding on to equipment like it's theirs to keep. Mfume wasn't pulling any punches here. He said flat out that somebody needs to be held accountable because at the end of the day, this is our money. As taxpayers, we're paying for equipment that's just sitting there with no checks, no balances. And meanwhile, these contractors are still collecting their checks. He's right, it's costing us, and that's not okay.
I'd like to go to you, Mr. Tenaglia, for just a moment, if I might. You spoke about contractors and the fact that so many are holding, for lack of a better term, property, and that they are not just here in the United States, but all over the globe. In looking at this practice, for lack of a better term, are we able to assign a dollar value or an approximation of the value of that property worldwide?
Yes, we are able. I don't have that specific number with me today. We can provide that to you, but that is part of the process, making sure we have an understanding of the exact amount of property, where it's located. The efforts that we have underway are all about getting after exactly doing how can we inventory that. The nature of government contracts, particularly in DoD, is such that it's to our benefit to provide contractors with government furnished property, as we call it. It helps from an efficiency standpoint. It helps them reuse the existing property that we have available to us, and that's less that we would have to pay for a given contract if we're able to give them property to use. And so it's very important for us to embed that requirement for accountability into our contractors and then to actually enforce those terms.
So you will return that information or get that information to this committee?
The total amount, yes, sir.
Yes, and I'm assuming you've had a chance to look at the total amount at some point in time. Would you consider it to be a staggering amount of money?
So reading what the GAO has observed, it is staggering. I believe on the order of $3 trillion, something to that effect.
Okay,
but we'll get you the specific amount.
Yeah, it's alarming to me. I don't know how other people feel about it. That's a lot of money. What is the reclamation process for much of this equipment after a contract ends?
So the disposition of property, and I should come back to what I was just referring to, would be probably the total property, not necessarily the property that's in the possession of contractors. But the reclamation process goes to how we disposition property. For example, in the GAO report, they talked about dispositioning spare tires for aircraft that's no longer functional. And so there's an adjudication process that the government undertakes with the contractor to understand whether that property could be destroyed or otherwise reused.
Let me go to you, Mr. Khan, if I might, for just a moment. I appreciated the scenario that you drew for us of the launching of a spacecraft and how in that process, which is rather benign, of course you have a pre-flight checklist, if I understood you correctly. And that pre-flight checklist are all the things that ought to be in place before there's an attempt to try to launch in order to be able to find out where the deficiencies are, how to correct them, and how to prevent them from happening again. And so this pre-flight checklist obviously deals with accountability, and more accountability. But at the end of the day, it fortifies our national defense. I want you to walk me back through that again and talk to some extent, or even give examples of how inaccurate inventories in DoD's financial system can hinder mission-critical needs.
Thank you for that question, Congressman Mfume. Just speaking about the audit process, the checklist, it's checks the inventory, it checks where the assets are, what the count is, what the condition is, what the location is. That has a direct impact on readiness. There have been instances as part of the audit process where DoD themselves have found assets in warehouses, like Black Hawk helicopters, which were not on the property records. They have found missile motors that were not on the records. They have found other assets. As a result, they were able to reprioritize those assets, put them where they could be put to great use. So in that respect, getting audit readiness really does impact the military's readiness.
Well, I'm glad you brought up these Black Hawk helicopters, which I also find amazing. Can you kind of give us some background on how that problem even became a problem?
It goes back to the property records where the assets are recorded. It goes back to the older and antiquated system. They are meant to really support very localized operations, and in many cases, they do not communicate with each other. So in this case, the Black Hawk helicopters were in one particular system, but they were not communicating with the system which was reporting that information higher up. And when the team of auditors went to the warehouse, they discovered the helicopters in a warehouse, but they weren't on the inventory records. That's how they were discovered in this particular instance.
So is it fair to assume that DoD has no pre-flight checklist?
Yes, analogous with the
With the
audit.
example you gave,
Yes.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I want to tell you, my blood just boils when I read about what's happening in DOD and to hear the answers that we're hearing today, not because I'm angry at the people here, but this is ridiculous. We claim to be the greatest country in the world, and yet we cannot, the Department of Defense cannot produce a clean audit. What in the heck is this? It makes no sense. It makes no sense. It does not, I love your analogy of a rocket launch, but you know it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out how to do an audit or how to find things that belong to your office.
Representative Summer Lee really laid it out. She said it like it is. Our military is out here spending money like water running down the drain. It's like they're living in a world where budget limits don't apply. Meanwhile, back in our communities, folks are getting pennies when they need actual help.
I want to thank the joint subcommittees for holding this hearing on the financial mismanagement of the Department of Defense. I think this is one of the few areas where I can agree with my Republican colleagues on the need and nature of this oversight. When we dedicate so many of our resources to our military while we nickel and dime our other programs, the least we are owed is transparency and accountability. When our country spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined, we rightfully have high expectations for how that department functions. Yet, year after year, we shovel billions their way, 15% of our total budget. We continue to be disappointed, and the American people are let down. Mr. Tenaglia, how much did the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act authorize for shipbuilding?
I do not have that particular figure.
Yeah.
The total amount of contract obligations in
Yeah.
2022 was over $400 billion.
For shipbuilding, it authorized $32.6 billion. Do you know how many school lunches that amount could provide to hungry children in America, where for the 1 in 8 children who go to school hungry, that may be the only meal they get? All of them, and then some. The school lunch program cost $28.7 billion in 2022. Mr. Tenaglia, how much on average does the military spend on Viagra each year?
I don't have that figure, ma'am.
About $41.6 million. Do you know how many bridges in my district of Pittsburgh could be repaired with that amount? About 2. The rebuilding of the Fern Hollow Bridge, which of course collapsed the day that President Biden happened to be coming to Pittsburgh, cost about $25.3 million to rebuild. Mr. Tenaglia, how much did the Department of Defense spend on snow crab and Alaska king crab in 2018?
I do not have that amount.
According to Open the Books, it was $2.3 million. Do you know how much the Pittsburgh City Council spends each year serving the county's unhoused population? Only 1.2 million, but they're certainly not being served Alaska king crabs. According to an investigation by this committee in 2016, the F-35 program specifically raked up hundreds of millions of dollars in added costs due to mismanagement and negatively affected military readiness. Mr. Tenaglia, how much is the F-35 joint program estimated to cost the federal government to produce, operate, and sustain over its lifetime?
I believe the GAO cited that figure. I don't have it in front of me, but we can get that for you.
It's about 1.7 trillion, enough to completely eradicate student loan debt. According to the Government Accountability Office, between May 2018 and October 2022, about 1 million F-35 spare parts worth 85 million were, quote, lost, just vanished. Losing millions of dollars in assets is unacceptable. DoD themselves do not oversee or account for certain F-35 spare parts. Only the prime contractors maintains this information. Mr. Khan, how does this lack of access to contractor information hinder accountability and DoD's ability to provide accurate reporting in its audit?
It severely impacts DoD's ability to be able to provide accountability over those assets.
Mr. Tenaglia, going forward, what steps can your office take to improve contract requirements on the front end to enable better oversight during the life of the contract?
So we're taking those actions now, improving the clauses, the terms and conditions that go into contracts that communicate to contractors what the requirements are for property management, and the government furnished property module that I described. It's the means by which contractors can communicate how they are dispositioning property, how they're receiving property, and where we know where that property is throughout its life.
Okay. Thank you. In 2019, this committee led a bipartisan hearing to hold military contractors TransDigm accountable for its exorbitant profits on DoD contracts for spare parts. This pressure led to TransDigm repaying DoD $16.1 million. Last Congress, this committee held a second hearing, again on the excess profits that TransDigm received. I'll note that my Republican colleagues did not join our call for TransDigm to repay its excess profits, even though TransDigm has a track record of fleecing American taxpayers. TransDigm likes to acquire companies with sole source DoD contracts and then exploit its monopoly position by hiking up prices on crucial spare parts. Mr. Tenaglia, what policy changes is DoD considering to prevent price gouging on sole source contracts, and are there specific legislative reforms that would assist this effort?
So as I indicated in my written statement, Section 803 of the FY23 NDAA helps us in that regard. It will require contractors to provide the transparent cost and pricing data that we need. In the case of commercial items, likely that will be uncertified information, but by the same token, our contracting officers need access to that information in order to establish fair and reasonable price.
Thank you. It's my time, but I want to say I urge the department to do better. Your department accounts for 15% of the total budget. You need to be more mindful in not only how you spend America's tax dollars, but also how you account for it. Millions of dollars should not just be lost, and failing audits should not be the norm. That is unacceptable.
Gentlemen, what an uncomfortable hearing, is it not? But let me say it's uncomfortable for the entire American citizenry to gaze upon this bizarre realm of D.C. and wonder how it operates when we're facing now $32 trillion in debt. We've added $1 trillion in 1 month, by the way. And the most ravenous leviathan of our government that devours the people's wealth is the Department of Defense, the Pentagon. What a culture we have allowed to become manifest in those halls of ultimate power and military might and expenditure of the people's treasure. Yet we were warned on the year of my birth, 1961, in his farewell speech, President Eisenhower said the following: "This conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is the new American experience, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. I have a copy of the NDAA of that year, the 1962 NDAA as drafted in 1961. I have a copy of it on my desk. It's 1 page long, $7.5 billion, covers the entire expenditure. My, how we have descended into the belly of this beast. In the private sector, a corporate entity or business goes to a bank for financial establishment and is therefore subject to audit. On a regular basis, the bank audits that business. If the business passes the audit, then the business can return to the bank for more money. If the business fails the audit, what do you think happens, Mr. Mansfield? Can that business go to the bank and get more money?
Cannot.
Cannot. Or maybe it's a minor error. Maybe it's a minor error. They make adjustments. They have another audit. They fail that audit. Does the bank change course? Say, well, you tried. We're going to give you money. Can they get money, Mr. Mansfield? They cannot. Thank you for your candor. Here's the problem with this bank. We don't even have the money. We're giving you $1 trillion a year almost now. We just added $1 trillion to our national debt in 1 month. It's an arrogantly abusive culture that we have allowed to become manifest over there, that devours the people's wealth.
We're considering an almost $890 billion NDAA bill this week. The only thing that's actually growing faster than the DoD budget is, as a budget unit, is our interest on our national debt. That's the only thing that's growing faster than that. So I thank you for being here. Mr. Tenaglia, I have to tell you, I am disappointed that your colleagues did not make today's hearing a priority, but I am grateful that you were here. DoD's budget accounts for nearly half the federal discretionary budget, and DoD is responsible for nearly 75% of government assets. Mr. Khan, DoD's financial management has been on GAO's high-risk list since when?
1995.
And this highlights the exposure of taxpayer-funded resources to waste, fraud, abuse, or mismanagement, because it's nearly 30 years DoD has been on that high-risk list. It's already been discussed today. Last fall, DoD failed its 5th consecutive audit and was unable to account for 61% of its $3.5 trillion in assets. Yet after more than 15 years of audit readiness and remediation efforts, DoD has yet to produce a clean audit. Mr. Mansfield, how much money has DoD spent on audit readiness over the past 15 years?
Sir, I don't know over the past 15 years. I don't have that in front of me, but what I can tell you, since 2018, audit support, which is responding to auditor requests, is right around $1 billion. And audit remediation efforts, that is putting controls, developing corrective action plans, that's around $3 billion.
$3 billion?
Yes, sir.
So a total about $4 billion?
That's correct.
And still can't manage to pass a stinking audit. Mr. Khan, what factors contributed to DoD's inability to pass a financial audit?
It's primarily the capacity. It's got 2 parts to that. One is antiquated systems. They are unable to produce reliable information. And the other one is a trained workforce, people who know the end-to-end DoD business processes, and they know how to work new modern systems.
Same question for you, Mr. Mansfield.
I don't have a whole lot to add there. I think it really is just antiquated systems and just a lack of understanding what their processes and procedures are.
Mr. Tenaglia?
I think the internal controls and also the inability of our systems to communicate with one another. In my written statement, I described the procure-to-pay process, the end-to-end process from financial inception of a requirement in through contract and payment on that contract. And so behind that, we are instituting a number of standards that will enable.
Okay, let me ask you this next question. Mr. Tenaglia, what are the consequences for failing to pass an audit to DOD?
In the case, well, in the domain that I work in the procurement and contracting, it relates to our inability to.
What's the consequences?
The consequence, inability to understand where our assets are.
So the response of this body is that we just keep throwing more money there, right? You don't know where the assets are, but we're going to keep giving you more money. So the NDAA top line is increasing by $23 billion this year. Inflation adjusted, it will be the highest DOD budget since World War II. Highest. And Mr. Higgins here, the audit line of questioning that he was engaged in, the problem is, he said, Mr. Mansfield correctly answered that if you fail an audit, you're not going to get more money from the bank. And he says, well, we're the bank. The problem is, the bank just keeps giving you more money. So, Mr. Tenaglia, there is no consequence. You may not know where everything is, but we're going to give you more money. It just keeps happening. And that's what's going to happen tonight at 10 p.m. We'll finish it off tomorrow. We'll do amendments tonight, and then tomorrow we'll pass it out, and we're going to send it to the Senate, and you guys are going to get more money than you've ever had.
And then Representative Jasmine Crockett stepped up and put it all out there. She didn't hold back, calling out the Department of Defense for failing, plain and simple. Crockett's right. With all this waste, it's time for the DOD to just admit they're dropping the ball. No more excuses, no more dancing around the issue.
I don't want to be redundant. I think that if we haven't figured out by now, we know that y'all are constantly failing, right? And honestly, our job is to win for the American people. And so while this committee tends to be probably the most divided committee in the Congress, especially this Congress, it is amazing the times that we can agree. And we agree that right now taxpayer dollars are being wasted. I'm gonna just keep it all the way real. And what's frustrating to me is that while I applaud my colleagues from the other side of the aisle bringing this and pointing out that there is definitely a ridiculous amount of waste when it comes to defense, and that doesn't mean I'm anti-defense before the haters on Twitter start getting crazy, because we all want to be free, we all want to feel safe here in this country, and we appreciate what defense does for us. But everyone has to be held accountable, especially when we are dealing with the budget deficits that we're dealing with, especially when we are dealing with the inflation that we're dealing with. And unfortunately, I sat through Rules Committee this week, and it took everything in me not to blow up. Because I had colleagues from the other side of the aisle as we are dealing with NDAA, and we have real things to address, such as how are we going to get DOD on track? Do you know what they wanted to talk about? Do you know what these amendments are gonna deal with? They're gonna deal with things that don't have anything to do with the budget, such as they want to talk about if they're going to deny access to healthcare for women. That's a priority in NDAA. They wanted to talk about whether or not trans folk would have access to the health care that they need. That's what they want to talk about. They want to deal with the things, and of course they want to fight about Ukraine and not recognize that it is important that this modern day democracy is upheld. So what I want to talk about is getting to the point that, number one, we only got here because there were certain people that decided that they were going to hold the entire country hostage in the debt ceiling fight. And so as part of the agreement was that all of those people that need Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, all of those programs that people are relying upon, SNAP benefits, as we're dealing with record inflation, they got less money and defense got more. That is exactly what happened. Somebody got more, somebody got less, because we cared more about let's try to balance the budget on the backs of people that are only getting $6 a day for things like SNAP benefits, instead of focusing on the waste that's going on here. And so the only question that I have for you is, what do you need from us? What is needed so that we can actually stop being performative. Because what I don't want us to do is try to pretend as if we really care about this waste that's going on by having this hearing on the same day that, as it's already been said by my colleague, Mr. Biggs, this is gonna get voted out. And y'all are gonna get more money. That's gonna happen. And you know what? We're still gonna have more people that are facing homelessness in this country. We're still gonna have more people that are hungry in this country. And honestly, I can promise you, I would rather give more people that $6 a day to eat than to sit here and say, well, we just haven't fixed it. If we know that the problem is that we have not modernized, what is the problem with modernizing? Why can't we? Because it's not for a lack of resources. Is there anyone that can tell me why we cannot modernize, especially since we have the best military in this country, but we can't figure out how to count our money and count our guns? We can't figure that out. Somebody help me, anybody. This is a real question. What is the problem?
So with respect to clean audit and auditability, we, as has been previously said, retirement of the legacy systems is a significant part of the path to do that. And so we do need to get after that. That's the most significant from the procurement.
Let me stop you right there. We need to get after that. Tell me why we haven't, is my question.
I think it's just a matter of the number of systems that we're having to evaluate for retirement and incorporation of a modernized business process to capture.
Let me ask you this. So can we agree that all the systems need to go? I mean, how modern are any of these systems? Can we not just agree that we need to scrap it and we need to get up to date? This is the same body where we're dealing with AI conversations. Like we haven't even been brought up to today, let alone the future. Can we not just agree that we need to scrap and we need to move on instead of like pontificating? Because I feel like that's what's happening, and it's happening on the American people's dime.
The approach we're taking is to promulgate standards that are feeding the data between those systems. So regardless, I don't think it's realistic that we're going to be able to clean slate them all. And so the systems that we have, forcing procurement standards and other standards so that the systems can talk to one another.
And Mr. Chair, I know I'm out of time, but if I could just ask this last question. Can you give me a reasonable amount of time to get through to modernizing these systems? Just a reasonable number.
There's systems within my responsibility. I could speak to those, but I'm not familiar.
And okay, so speak to
I would
those.
say within a 5-year period.
Thank you so much.
So audits are one of our best tools in ensuring oversight and accountability. They give us a chance to look at the financial records and accounting documents and ultimately ensure that assets and liabilities are tracked over time. That is, as long as we're achieving an unmodified or clean audit. Mr. Manfield, very simple question. When did the Department of Defense go through its first full scope consolidated financial statement audit?
That's 2018.
2018. Mr. Manfield, did the DoD achieve a clean audit in 2019?
No.
What about in 2020?
No.
What about in 2021?
No.
2022?
No.
Year after year, we hope that the DoD will attain a clean audit, and year after year, the DoD fails. DoD is the only major federal agency with this level of consistent failure as it relates to an audit. Mr. Khan, in an attempt to meet the essential standards of accountability, some components of the DoD introduced reforms, including correcting around $5.2 billion in cost assessments and innovations like the deployment of hundreds of bots aligned to financial management processes. Why have these measures all failed to get DoD to have a clean audit?
The issue at DoDs are much more pervasive. Some of what you mentioned, I mean, those are the bright spots. It is helping that DoD is embracing technology and using some of the robotic process automation. It is freeing up the resources to be able to do more analytical work. But the problems are very pervasive across DoD, and that's why it's taking them time.
DoD's antiquated and mismatching financial management systems are a cause for concern. It's part of the reason that they've been on the GAO's high-risk list since 1995. Yes or no, has GAO ever outlined what DoD could do to get them off the list?
Yes, we have.
Go ahead.
It's on a high-risk list. We have 5 removal criteria, and we've been very specific as to what DoD needs to do to come off the list.
And there's been many agencies that have gotten on this list and been taken off, have followed your recommendations. Usually when GAO gives recommendations, how long does it usually take for agencies to implement them and get off the list?
The one parallel I can draw is DHS, which is a much smaller agency. It took them 10 years from inception to getting a clean audit opinion. Having said that, they continue to be on the high-risk list because of some issues they're having with technology.
Failing an audit doesn't necessarily indicate that funds are being misused or lost funds. In fact, people can achieve a clean audit and still be misusing funds. However, I refuse to accept the status quo that DOD just can't get a clean audit. Mr. Mansfield, when does DOD estimate that you'll be able to pass a clean audit? Oh, can you turn on your mic, I think?
The DOD has estimated that they are looking at 2028.
2028.
Yes, sir.
I have several questions I want to get to, so I would just ask that you answer them quickly. If you filibuster, I will interrupt you. This morning, we've already heard DOD has been on GAO's high-risk list since 1995. Mr. Khan, I dropped out of high school in 1995, a very long time ago. Are there any other federal agencies which have consistently failed to meet basic accounting standards since I dropped out of high school? Yes or no?
No.
All right, Mr. Mansfield, DOD has never had a clean audit, yet last month a DOD spokesperson claimed it's on track for a clean audit by 2027. I always hear, if I had $1 for every time I heard, hey, we're on track, we're gonna get you this or that. So why should Congress believe the department now will meet this goal when it's never done so ever in its history? What's changed?
I can't speak on behalf of the DOD itself. We provide oversight of them, so I would say we're going to continue from the Office of Inspector General's perspective to validate and be transparent in our conclusions on that in terms of how
so no answer. All right, got it. Okay, Mr. Tenaglia, the retirement of legacy systems is part of what you're saying needs to be modernized, and yet the DOD uses a 25-year-old defense travel system to book billions and billions of dollars in travel expenses every year. This legacy system wastes hundreds of millions of dollars annually due to inefficiency and overpayments. They were on track to modernize the system, which would be a good thing, per your comments earlier. But in May, the department abruptly canceled a $374 million contract to replace the system with a more modern version. Who's responsible for that decision?
I believe that's under the purview of the Office of the Undersecretary for Personnel and Readiness.
Okay, do you believe if you're in charge of wasting $374 million on a contract that you should keep your job, yes or no?
I would not characterize that.
So you don't have an answer. Got it. All right. The defense travel system has incurred over $965 million in improper payments from fiscal year 2016 to 2018. Exactly how large will that number get if the system remains in use?
I don't have the answer for that.
You don't have any answers today. Okay. So if you're responsible for losing $965 million, which is almost $1 billion in improper payments, should the person responsible for those losses keep their job, yes or no?
I don't know that would be.
You don't have an answer. Okay, so what's the plan going forward? Do you plan to stay with the defense travel system for another 25 years? Do they plan to start from scratch? And how much more money is going to be wasted?
I would defer to the Office of Personnel.
No more. So nobody has any answers. That's the thing. When we have these hearings, you guys come to our committee, we have specific questions, we want specific answers, we're wasting billions of dollars every single year, and no one that comes before these committees ever have any answers. They have no solutions. So like, what are you guys doing? I don't understand. And quite frankly, I've been up here for 2.5 years. I've been very jaded in a very short period of time. I don't know if it's incompetency or ignorance. Like, I really don't. And I don't understand why any of that is okay. It's not okay. In the business sector, if you lose $1 billion, you lose your job. Or you have an audit. You have to pass an audit to get, as we've heard today, to get financing, to get lending, to get the bank to do business with you. And yet you just have a free check, a free pass. All these agencies have a free pass from us, and they're going to get another free pass. DOD is going to get another free pass today with no one being held accountable, no one being held responsible, no one taking responsibility, no one's in charge. Like, I just don't understand the incompetency with any of this. I don't get it. I'm not impressed. We're just going to basically shrug our shoulders and just sit here with our hands, crossed, that we're just going to continue to waste billions of dollars. No one's in charge. No one's responsible. No one's ever going to be held accountable, and everybody gets to keep their job. And it's wrong, and it's bullshit.
I want to focus a little bit on Ukraine and the money that the United States Congress has appropriated to support our Democratic ally against an illegal, unwarranted, and global-altering war of aggression by an authoritarian dictator, Vladimir Putin. And I want to focus a little bit on the oversight, especially with you, Mr. Mansfield, because I think on both sides of the aisle, we very much want to ensure that there is strong oversight and accountability to ensure that the money that Congress has authorized and appropriated in support of Ukraine is used as it is intended to be used. And I would note that Inspector General Storch testified earlier this year to the Armed Services Committee that the situation in Ukraine is fluid and calls for continuous agile oversight. Mr. Mansfield, can you describe the OIG efforts to execute that agile oversight?
Yes, thank you for the question. First, I would say that we have partnered with our oversight, with the oversight community writ large. So between the State Department, the Agency for International Development, and the Department of Defense Office of Inspectors General, we've formed a working group where we collectively come together to talk about what meaningful oversight should be occurring within Ukraine related to the funding being provided in support. For the DoD Office of Inspector General, to date we've issued four reports and 7 advisories related to anything from tracking of the funds appropriated or supplemental funds to the department's processes and State Department's processes for tracking and monitoring, end-use monitoring of military equipment that's been provided. We have 18 ongoing projects related to anything from training of Ukrainian forces to execution of the funds provided under the supplemental appropriations. And we have another 3 projects right now planned, but there's more in the works as well.
And has Ukraine generally been cooperative with DoD's efforts to do the tracking and oversight that you just described?
So from our perspective at the OIG, we've gotten cooperation from the Department of Defense in terms of our oversight of their efforts to oversight the Ukrainians' use of the equipment that's provided. So we haven't had any difficulties there yet.
I appreciate that, and I thank the department broadly for having such robust oversight. I think it is often mischaracterized, and it's important for you to recite all of those efforts as you just did in terms of oversight. We are dealing right now, as one of my colleagues on the other side, or Mr. Frost mentioned, about we're dealing with the NDAA and appropriations and support for the department. And one of the things that has become a very hot-button issue, sadly, is support for Ukraine. Many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle seem to fundamentally misunderstand the purpose of our support to Ukraine. Ukraine is a democracy. Russia is an authoritarian regime that is trying to conquer and overtake a democracy. And when we talk about America first, we're talking about America's national security. And if my colleagues don't realize that the support of a robust democracy and robust democracies broadly around the world do not relate to our national security, then they fundamentally misunderstand global engagement and foreign policy and what makes us safe here at home. I was very disturbed to see that the chairman of this committee, not the subcommittee, but the committee, went on television last week, I believe, to say that President Biden is scared of conducting oversight of what is going on in Ukraine, and I appreciate you outlining all of the extensive efforts that the department is doing to provide that oversight. And I would just urge the department to continue to do that oversight, and I'd urge my colleagues on the other side of the aisle not to defend
and take the side of a dictator in Vladimir Putin trying to overtake and dominate and conquer a democratic nation that needs our support.
On the other side of things, we saw Representative Byron Donalds stepping up to defend the Republicans. When Representative Dan Goldman brought up Ukraine and Russia, Donalds had a lot to say. He challenged Goldman's points, pushing back on the idea that supporting Ukraine is a straightforward move and highlighting the Republican stance on focusing funds at home rather than abroad.
Allow me to actually respond to my colleague on the other side of the aisle. The issue with Ukraine is not that members on my side of the aisle don't want to support a democracy in Ukraine. That is not the issue. The issue is that while spending upwards of $114 billion in said conflict with, frankly, no end in sight, because the president has not led in any of this effort, mind you. He was drug into this conflict because of his own dereliction of duty when Russia was amassing troops on the Ukrainian border for 6 months and President Biden did nothing. He dithered, he ignored. And only when Putin actually went in, his first comment to Vladimir Zelensky was, "I'll send a G5 for you, hop on the plane and let's go home." That's what he told Vladimir Zelensky. And it was only until the Ukrainian president and, frankly, people around the world said, we should stand for Ukraine, then Joe Biden did an about-face. So that's number one. Number two, the issue that a lot of Americans are having right now is that we have spent $114 billion on the Ukrainian conflict to defend Ukraine, which, by the way, I do think we should do. But at the same time, we have recklessly disregarded our own southern border and our own national security, which is affecting many states, many counties, many localities who are now not just on the southern border, but basically in every city in the country. Don't believe me? Go ask Eric Adams, the mayor of New York, who is now very concerned about the fact that we have more migrants in the city of New York than they have space for because of President Biden's reckless policy on the southern border. So I would urge my colleague on the other side of the aisle is don't do this in a vacuum. Please understand that you have members who want to be supportive of Ukraine, but they are very concerned and now at this point apoplectic that we have spent $115 billion on Ukraine, but we can't secure our southern border. That is why members on my side of the aisle are furious, frankly, with Joe Biden and those who want to use Ukraine as a leverage point.
Will the gentleman yield for
I'm
a
not
quick
yielding.
question?
You had your time. I'll let you talk. I was going to interrupt you, but I didn't want to. I ain't yielding. Now, point number three, and this is very, very clear. With respect to Ukraine's sovereignty, I'm very familiar with the Bucharest Agreement. I think every member of the chamber is now familiar with this agreement. We signed on to protect their sovereignty if Ukraine returned their nuclear ballistic missiles back to Russia. That was the '94 agreement. We signed on to that as the United States of America. I believe that we should uphold that agreement. I do. But when you see Russian troops amassing on the border of the same country we have an agreement to protect, and you do nothing, your inaction as the commander-in-chief cost the United States taxpayer $115 billion. That's why members on this side of the aisle are frustrated with Joe Biden and his lack of action. Now back to the Department of Defense, because that's what I'm really here to do, but I had to set the record straight. Here's the issue.
May I just ask a question quickly?
No, because you're not recognized. Now, back to the Department of Defense. Here's the issue we're having. We want to spend money to defend this nation and to make sure that our men and women have every piece of equipment necessary to do so. We want to make sure they have all the bullets, all the tanks, all the ships, all the equipment necessary. But the frustration you're having in Congress, you're seeing, which I'm going to tell you right now is growing, is the complete disregard for fiscal sanity at the Department of Defense. We cannot continue to just fund contracts in infinitum with no idea of how we're actually going to acquire the material we're paying for, getting the material that we have maintained in an orderly and timely fashion, and that the men and women who are on the front lines, not the brass, not the people over at the Pentagon, the men and women who are on the front line are getting what they need in a timely fashion. I don't think you would have many issues from Congress to be able to fund that. But, and I think Mr. Khan, you spoke to this before in your comments as I was watching the hearing before I came in, the issue is that DOD can't even find a way to just go through the audit process and come through with minimal findings, which is something that publicly traded companies have to do, and it's something that the current SEC would demand they do. Forget the other agencies for that matter. So that's the issue we're having at the Department of Defense. I want to fund our military. I want us to be a lean, mean fighting machine. That's what I want. But as a member on the Republican side of the aisle, I got serious concerns about funding the agency if the bloat and the waste continues. Procurement reform is critical. Last quick question, I believe I'm gonna send it to you, Mr. Mansfield. I understand that we spend a ton of money on diesel fuel, but don't you believe that finishing the Project Pele project and actually getting it up and running and doing it consistently, won't that be to the betterment of the Department of Defense? And I'll close off that.
Sir, I'll take that one for the record.
And then we had Representative Katie Porter, who brought her own twist to this hearing with a game she called Jeopardy DOD. Only Katie Porter would make a game out of calling out the Department of Defense. But honestly, this game wasn't for fun. It was all about showing just how out of touch the DOD can be when it comes to where their money's going.
In Washington, the same game is played year after year. The president requests a massive defense budget. Lawmakers don't want to be seen as soft on national security, and defense lobbyists exploit that. Congress then falls into line and passes an expensive defense package. And then we do the same thing again the next year. That's the game that lawmakers and lobbyists play with our tax dollars. Today, we are going to play a new game. Welcome to Jeopardy DOD, where our witnesses will uncover waste, missing guardrails, and the enablers who make our defense budget balloon. Witnesses, you'll pick a category and a point amount. I'll read you a prompt, and just like in regular Jeopardy, you'll give the answer in the form of the question. For example, if I read, the Congresswoman hosting Jeopardy DOD, you will say, who is Katie Porter? Let's get started. Mr. Tenaglia. Enablers for 100. A president who called how much we spend on defense crazy, but let defense spending grow by over $100 billion in one term.
I don't know the answer to that question.
Really? You don't know who called the defense budget crazy? Who is Donald Trump? Mr. Mansfield.
Enablers for 200.
Enablers for 200. A member of Senate leadership who recently said funding the Pentagon at $886 billion would mean defense is radically underfunded.
I don't know the answer.
Who is Mitch McConnell? Mr. Khan, you can easily be the winner here.
I'll take waste for 300.
Great choice. Waste for 300. Ineffective DOD assets that cost about $600 million to build and are now being decommissioned before the end of their useful life.
I'm drawing a blank there, sorry.
What are littoral combat ships? You're familiar with this program. Mr. Tenaglia.
Enablers for 300.
Pardon me?
Enablers for 300.
Enablers for 300. Individuals who get rich while pushing to overspend our tax dollars.
I don't know.
Who are defense lobbyists? Mr. Mansfield.
Waste for 200.
Waste for 200. I'm really counting on you here, Mr. Mansfield. A program that is $183 billion over budget and 10 years behind schedule.
What is the Joint Strike Fighter program?
What is the what?
Is it the Joint Strike Fighter program?
That's correct. What is the F-35 program? Correct. Mr. Khan.
Missing guardrails for 200.
Missing guardrails for 200. The institution that has authorized more defense spending than the president requested for the current fiscal year. Who has authorized more defense spending than the president requested for this current 2023 fiscal year?
I would say it's the Armed Services Committee.
We'll give you that. Who is? Congress. Mr. Tenaglia, I'd really love to see you get one right here. I'm rooting for you.
Missing guardrails for 100.
Missing guardrails for 100. This one I think you're going to know. A review that every agency has passed except the DOD.
What is an audit?
What is an audit? Correct. Mr. Mansfield.
We'll go with missing guide rails for 300.
Missing guardrails for 300. This is a really good one. The percentage of DOD's assets that it cannot account for.
61%.
61%.
What is 61%?
Huh?
What is 61%?
What is 61%? So I read the question wrong. The percentage of DOD assets that it can account for is 39%. You're right. Cannot account for 61%. Can account for 39. All right, Mr. Khan.
Is that double jeopardy?
Yes.
100.
This is it. Waste for 100. DOD assets that have been lost, damaged, or destroyed to the tune of millions of dollars based on a May GAO report. What are spare aircraft parts? We're out of time for Jeopardy DOD, and the winner here today should be the American people. Because no matter who uncovers the most waste, the important thing is that we provide long overdue oversight to the taxpayers. Look, politicians and lobbyists play the same spending game year after year, and that is not getting us to a responsible defense budget. Nobody's going to win until we start playing a new game.
Representative Jared Moskowitz stepped in to give Representative Dan Goldman a chance to respond to Byron Donalds' statement from earlier. It was clear that Moskowitz wanted to make sure all sides got a fair say, and Goldman didn't waste the opportunity to speak his mind.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield some of my time to Representative Goldman.
Thank you. I thank the distinguished gentleman from Florida for yielding a little time. I want to briefly address another one of my distinguished colleagues from Florida's earlier remarks, and in mostly saying that there was a 6-month buildup of Russian troops on the border and somehow President Biden did nothing to deter Russia from invading Ukraine. I find it odd to hear a Republican supporter of Donald Trump complain that we didn't do more earlier to deter Russia. We all remember in 2019, Donald Trump withheld all of the military and security assistance Congress appropriated to Ukraine in order to benefit his re-election campaign. And in fact, on the contrary, Joe Biden, as president, did share intelligence to rally around our European allies to support Ukraine in a meaningful way that actually offset the need for us to provide as much financial assistance. But I'm glad to hear that Mr. Donalds supports Ukraine in its war against Russia, and I hope that he can convince his colleagues, including some on this committee, not to strip all funding for Ukraine in the NDAA. I thank my colleague for yielding, and I yield back.
Thank you. So we're talking about the NDAA while this hearing's going on, supporting our defense, supporting our country, keeping our military superiority over China. It passed 58-1 in committee. Bipartisan, how it has always been and how it should be, except now it's held hostage. It's held hostage over the culture war, right? It's not about defense, it's not about protecting the American people. No, it's about abortion or defending the Confederacy based on amendments that my colleagues have filed. Or it's about books again. We're back to books. Or it's about stopping mitigation to climate change. Anyone right now who's currently experiencing record flooding or record heat, they're not worried about defending the country. No, they're worried about stopping mitigation to climate change. The Senate's going to kick all this back to us. They're going to wipe all this culture war nonsense out. And so this is just theater. It's not about defending the country. They're holding up 250 nominees in the Senate to our military. My colleagues across the aisle are doing that. We can't appoint the head of the Marine Corps because of the culture wars. Hasn't happened since 1910. In October, when we're going to see the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff probably retire, nope, we won't be able to appoint that person either, based on this nonsense if it continues. But they're focused on the audit of the Pentagon. Can you imagine if someone audited this committee? Oh wait, I have that audit of this committee. Actually, it's in form of an indictment. That's the audit of this committee. It's an indictment by the Department of Justice because this committee is focusing on working with foreign agents, right? We want to talk about national security. That's why you guys are here. It's about national security. But the main committee is working with an indicted Chinese agent who does business with the Iranian regime and is an illegal arms dealer to Libya. All of this in order to own Hunter Biden. That's how far they've stooped. It reads like a 007 movie, this indictment, except they're working with the villain. You know, that's why I've sent a letter to the China Select Committee, the chairman of that committee, to open up into an investigation into what's happening in oversight, because I'm deeply worried about whether the CCP has manipulated the information that's been provided this committee through their foreign agent that they're working with, and the information that they're then providing to the American people. It's also why I've sent a letter to the chairman of Foreign Affairs and the chairman of Homeland Security, because I need to know, and the American people need to know, they have a right to know, whether the indicted foreign agent, the illegal arms salesman who is working within the Iranian regime, who is a supporter of terrorism around the world, that's who they're working with. We need to know whether they have jeopardized Homeland Security in their search to help Donald Trump in his reelection.
And that wraps up today's breakdown. Thanks for joining me today. It's always good to talk through these moments and stay informed about what's going on in Congress. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on all the latest. And as always, thank you for watching, and remember to stay woke. See you in the next one.